I am not a man given to superstition. My name is Thomas Bradford, and I have always been a practical man, inclined toward reason and skepticism. I am an archaeologist specializing in ancient civilizations, and I've spent much of my life digging through forgotten ruins, handling artifacts that carry histories older than the very language I speak. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened after I found that medallion. It was the autumn of 1923 during an expedition into the New England countryside. Locals had told us about an old site, a grove filled with dead oaks where they claimed the shadows never moved as they should. I dismissed their warnings, of course. If every folk tale were to be taken seriously, my work would never progress. It was beneath the roots of one such dead oak that I found the medallion. It was not an accidental discovery. Something in that soil called to me. The earth was soft, as if it had been disturbed recently, yet there were no footprints, no signs of fresh digging. I dug with my hands until I uncovered the object. A metallic disc, ancient in appearance, worn by time, with a symbol etched into its surface, a misshapen circle containing an eye carved in such a way that depending on the angle of the light, it seemed to move. A chill ran down my spine as I touched it, but I attributed that to the morning cold. Deep inside, however, there was an unease I could not yet name. Little did I know that by removing that medallion from the ground, I had unleashed something that was never meant to wake. That night, I had the first dream. It was not an image, nor a coherent sequence of events, just sensations. A cold unlike any I had ever known, one that did not bite at the skin but seemed to sink directly into my bones. A damp, earthy smell, like soil freshly turned for a burial. And breathing. Not my own, not anything human. It was slow, deep, and deliberate, as if something immense and patient was waiting just beyond the veil of sleep. I woke with a start, my breath fogging in the autumn air of my tent. The medallion was still on my makeshift desk, catching the light of the lantern in such a way that the carved eye seemed to be staring right at me. The dreams continued. By the third night, they were no longer just sensations. I began to see her. At first, she was only a shadow at the edges of my vision, something shifting in the darkness. But soon she took form. She was tall, impossibly so, her limbs stretched and thin, as if someone had crudely sculpted a human figure from melted wax and let it cool into grotesque proportions. Her skin was dark and mottled, like old parchment left too long in damp air. And her eyes, no, there were no eyes. Just deep, empty slits where they should have been. Yet I could feel them. I could feel her looking at me, not just seeing me, but stripping me down to something beyond flesh, beyond thought. Each night, she came closer. By the fifth night, the whispers began. At first, they were just sounds, low, guttural murmurs that curled around my mind like creeping vines. But soon, they became words. I did not recognize the language, yet I understood. Promises and threats, intertwined so seamlessly that I could not distinguish one from the other. She spoke of knowledge beyond the stars, of names not meant to be uttered by human tongues. And she spoke of me. She knew me. She called me by name in a voice that slithered through my ears and into my skull, a voice that did not belong to anything of this earth. I woke drenched in sweat, my hands trembling as I clutched the medallion. I should have discarded it then. I should have buried it deep and left that cursed place. But I didn't. The morning after that night, I found something that turned my unease into full-blown terror. Near the entrance of my tent, the ground was damp with some dark, viscous substance. Too dark to be mere water, too thick to be mud. And there were footprints. Not mine. They were long, unnaturally so, with toes that tapered into sharp points. They led from the woods to my tent, stopping just inches from where I had been sleeping. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. An animal, perhaps. A trick of the light. But deep down, I knew the truth. She had been here, not just in my dreams. She had stood outside my tent, watching, waiting. That night, I did not want to sleep. I forced myself to stay awake, pacing my tent, lighting every lantern I had, muttering reassurances to myself that none of this was real. But exhaustion is a merciless thing. At some point, my body betrayed me, and I drifted into uneasy slumber. And there she was, closer than ever before. I could see every grotesque detail of her. Her waxen skin cracked in places, revealing something darker beneath, something that shifted and pulsed like raw muscle. Her arms hung too long at her sides, her fingers twitching as if eager to grasp. And those slits where her eyes should have been, I could feel them burrowing into me, peeling away every layer of my being. I tried to wake up. I fought against the dream, clawing my way toward consciousness, but I was trapped. And then she spoke again, the voice coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are seen," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "You are known." My limbs locked, as if unseen hands held me down. She leaned closer, her head tilting unnaturally, her mouth stretching into something that resembled a smile, but was far too wide, too filled with something shifting just beyond my sight. And then I felt it, a touch. Not physical, but something deeper, something pressing against the edges of my mind, slipping through cracks I didn't know existed. I woke with a scream, gasping, shaking. And in the darkness of my tent, I heard it. Not a whisper from a dream, not a trick of my mind. A breath, right next to me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The breath was slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to run, to flee into the night. But something told me that movement would only make things worse. The lantern's flame flickered, casting shifting shadows across the canvas of my tent. I forced myself to look. There, in the dim light, just beyond the foot of my cot, she stood, no longer confined to the realm of dreams. She was real. Her body loomed impossibly tall, her waxy flesh seeming to glisten as if damp. The slits where her eyes should have been were deeper now, cavernous, pulling at the air around them like an unseen gravity. Her smile stretched wider, too wide, revealing no teeth, no tongue, just blackness, a void where a mouth should be. The sight of her in the waking world shattered something in me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my hands clawing at the sheets as if they could somehow anchor me to sanity. I don't remember making the decision to move. One moment I was frozen, drowning in terror, and the next I was scrambling backward, knocking over the lantern in my panic. The flames sputtered, casting frantic shadows as I hit the ground, my breath ragged. She didn't move. She only watched, or at least I felt her watching. Then, with a slow, unnatural grace, she tilted her head, her neck bending at an angle no human spine should allow. From that gaping, black mouth came a sound. Not words this time, but something worse. A layered, warbling hum, like a chorus of voices trapped beneath deep water. It burrowed into my skull, pressing against the inside of my mind. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I lunged for my satchel, my fingers closing around the cold, cursed metal of the medallion. The moment my skin touched it, the hum in my head faltered. A flicker of hesitation passed over her form. So brief, I almost doubted I'd seen it. But it was enough. With shaking hands, I clutched the medallion tighter and, in a desperate, irrational act, I threw it at her. The moment it left my fingers, the air in the tent shifted, heavy, charged like the seconds before a thunderclap. The medallion struck her chest, and the reaction was immediate. The moment the medallion touched her, reality twisted. A sound erupted, not a scream, not a cry, but something vast and layered, as if 1,000 voices were speaking at once, overlapping in a cacophony that made my skull feel like it would split apart. The air itself rippled around her, and for the first time, she moved. Not with the slow, deliberate motions I'd seen before, but violently, her limbs jerking, contorting, as if something inside her was being pulled in all directions at once. The slits where her eyes should have been widened, and for the briefest moment, I saw something staring back at me from within that darkness. Something ancient, something hungry. Then, she began to dissolve. Her form wavered, breaking apart like ink dispersing in water, tendrils of shadow peeling away from her body. But even as she faded, I felt no relief, because she was not screaming in pain. She was laughing. That warbling, wet hum was now something else. Amusement, satisfaction. Not yet. The layered voices whispered, slithering into my ears as the last of her form vanished into the dim light of my collapsed lantern. And then, just like that, she was gone. For a long time, I didn't move. The tent felt impossibly still, yet the weight of her presence lingered, like a shadow burned into my vision after staring at the sun. My breath came in shallow gasps. My fingers still curled into useless claws, as if bracing for an impact that never came. The medallion lay on the ground where she had stood, dark and cold, its surface unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and something had changed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my things with frantic urgency, shoving everything into my satchel with shaking hands. I left the tent standing. I didn't care. I only wanted to be gone. As I walked away, my eyes flicked back to the medallion, lying half buried in the dirt. A rational man would have left it. A wise man would have destroyed it. But I am neither. Against every screaming instinct in my body, I picked it up and shoved it into my pocket. Because, despite everything I needed to know, I left the cursed grove behind, hiking back to civilization with the frantic energy of a man pursued. But no footsteps followed me. No whispers curled through the trees. It was as if she had never been there at all. Yet I knew better. I could feel in the weight of the medallion against my thigh. In a way, the world seemed just slightly off. Shadows stretched a little too long in the corners of my vision. The wind carried echoes I could not quite place. And worst of all, I knew that I had not rid myself of her. That night, in the safety of 1 miles away from that damn place, I dared to sleep. The exhaustion was too great, my body too weak to resist. And as soon as I closed my eyes, she was there. Not standing, not watching, but smiling. Closer than ever. I did not wake up screaming this time. I did not wake up at all, because when I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in my rented room. The air was damp, the ground beneath me soft, like freshly disturbed earth. The sky above me was wrong, black, swirling, empty. And I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach churn, that I had not woken at all. I was still dreaming. Or worse, I wasn't. I tried to move, to stand, to cry out, but my body betrayed me. My limbs were heavy, sluggish, as if encased in something far more sinister than mere sleep. The ground around me shifted, warping like it had been carved from some unnatural substance. And then, through the thick fog that began to encircle me, I heard her voice. Do you understand now? It was no longer just a whisper, no longer a hum. It was a command, a presence in the very air that seemed to crush the life out of me. You are mine, Thomas Bradford. The ground trembled beneath me, and the fog thickened into shapes, tall, twisted, human shapes that stretched unnaturally toward the sky. The shapes were familiar, too familiar, though I couldn't quite place them. They moved closer, their distorted forms pulsating as if they were alive, breathing, waiting. And then, there she was, no longer a figure of mere nightmares, but something far worse. Her skin had darkened, almost black now, like the tar pits I'd studied in distant lands. Her limbs were no longer waxen and frail, but grotesque, dripping with something foul and unearthly. Her smile stretched beyond comprehension. her mouth opening in a way that should have shattered the laws of nature. And her eyes, those slits where her eyes should have been, were now open wide, revealing pools of darkness that threatened to swallow everything around her. "You will never leave," she whispered, her voice now reverberating deep within my chest, as if it were coming from inside me. "Not while the eye sees, not while the cycle remains." I felt it then, the weight of her truth. The medallion in my pocket was not just a token. It was a seal, a binding, and I had broken it, released something far older than the earth itself. The cycle would not end, not until she claimed me completely. Desperation clawed at my mind. I couldn't stay there, I wouldn't. My fingers fumbled into my pocket, closing around the medallion, its surface impossibly cold. If it had the power to release her, then maybe, just maybe, it could banish her. It was foolish hope, but it was all I had. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced my body to move, to tear the medallion from my pocket and lift it toward her. "You want this?" I rasped, my voice barely a whisper beneath the crushing weight of her presence. "Then take it." And I did the only thing I could think of. I pressed it against my own skin. Pain. A burning, searing agony ripped through me, not in flesh, but in something deeper. My vision blurred, my ears filled with a deafening roar, and for a brief moment, I saw everything. The truth of her existence, the place beyond time where she came from, the ancient hunger that had been waiting for an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, my body trembling violently. I was back in my rented room. The wooden beams above me swayed slightly with the wind, the candle on the nightstand flickering weakly. But something was wrong. My fingers twitched, my breath came in shallow gasps, and then I felt it. The medallion was gone. I scrambled up, patting my pockets, searching the bedsheets, the floor, nothing. No trace of it, as if it had never existed. But the room was silent, too silent. My own breath sounded distant, my pulse an echo. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, where the candlelight barely reached, something shifted. A shadow, taller than it should be. She was still here, smiling,